I don't know if this is going to make you feel better at all, but I was just saying that it's an extremely technical essay and it went completely over my head. I after a point I didn't even know what I was reading. So yeah, so that's kind of where it stands. Maybe I'm going to hand over to Lakshmi if she can sort of just get us started on some ideas, and then maybe we can read parts of it together. I feel like using this time to actually read could be like beneficial. But Lakshmi, do you want to just start off with like your, just to kind of guide us in some direction, and then we can maybe take up paragraphs at a time and read. Yeah.
I think the first thing is the context in which he was writing this, which is in the 1900s. So within Western analytical philosophy at the time, there were two primary views of what art was. One that originated, the conception of art as a biological thing that existed in all societies. And the second was a cultural view that art developed in 18th century Europe with particular ideas revolving that separated art from craft and skill. And there was particular debate surrounding the cognitive value of art and whether other cultures around the world had conceptions of art that was the same, and whether we shared the same concept of what art was. So as my understanding of this is that's the context in which he was writing this, and he was trying to identify perhaps a concept of art for all of India, or the subcontinent as a whole, which itself is a very tricky project, just because the number of different artistic traditions, subcultures, and texts that exist here. But so there are two primary ways in which art has been viewed in ancient Greece and Rome. All human-made artifacts were seen as art. There was no particular conceptualization of a certain class of things, the high arts as we think of it today, painting, sculpture, as a separate category. And instead, the conceptual distinction was between art and nature. And nature was seen as the creative force that created everything. And art is seen as an imitation of nature. All human created artifacts fall under this category. So the concept of art was that of mimesis, imitation of nature. And many ancient theorists held that art was inferior to nature because it couldn't offer any truth or cognitive value that differentiated it from what nature could offer. It was just an imitation of the processes, principles of nature, drawn from direct observation of nature, rather than really an intellectual activity of its own. Or at least, even if it was considered an intellectual activity, it was seen as something that was inferior to observation of nature and nature's creations in and of itself. A change took place around 18th century in Europe when thinkers like Kant and Hegel they led to the conception of the discipline of aesthetics, which they argued was the purpose of art was not to imitate nature, but to bring to mind the truth about ourselves, as Hegel would put it, who we are and how we become. So art was not just for its own sake, but it's for beauty's sake. And Hegel's conception of beauty, for instance, was his form of self-understanding. His argument was that that an object in itself wasn't beautiful, but the effect that it has on us is that it sets our imagination free. It tells us something about ourselves. It's a way we express ourselves. So it's not just an imitation of nature, but in its own sense, it has some kind of intellectual value or content. And so I think the first distinction that he's trying to make here, as I understood in this chapter, he says Indian art is, it's rooted in the sense that it's always intellectual or contemplative in its process of making. So in the first paragraph, he goes on to describe the process of sadhana, and he says that's the foundation in which art begins. Whether only when you have the visualization you can set to work. And he makes the distinction between the concept of free art, that is art created for its own sake, and then servile art, which is art that's made for some other end. And he argues that was the basic distinction between art and craft. Art is seen as something pleasurable, something intellectual, something created for its own enjoyment, and craft that included things like maybe carpentry or boat making or basket weaving. They require technical skill, but they're generally seen as activities that are repetitive, that that don't that doesn't trigger our imaginations in the same way as art. So he's saying that distinction did not arise in Indian art. Everything here, whether it was made directly by an artist or whether it was traditionally a craft, whether it was made for its own sake or whether it was made for the religious or for another end, the intellectual process is at the heart of Indian art. That was my take on the first paragraph in the first. So maybe we can read that together and maybe think about what the role of imitation in art is, or what the value of the intellectual process behind it is, and how central that is, maybe to our conception of art.
So we're reading the very first paragraph, right?
Just pull up the text. So we're starting with Sukranithisara, which he translates as the transformation of nature in art. So it's that first paragraph, and then that little bit of the text that he quotes there as a demonstration of the intellectual process.
Okay, so I kind of got through up to like the end of the second page for the moment. So maybe I'm just going to voice out for my own sake what it is that I have understood so far. So the first paragraph, first page, kind of states, Lakshmi, what you just explained, right? This looking at art in kind of either two stages or two modalities: the art that is created, which is when the image is created in the artist's mind, and then when that image is converted into something that is like an artifact of sorts, something that is a product that you can hold. So that's kind of a second stage, and that's what he is defining as the free and the servile, which you just explained. Yeah. So am I also right in understanding that he suggests that for the first part of it, which is the free act of creating art, which means the artist sort of being able to create the image in his or her mind, he says that this is done based on the whatever canonical prescriptions, but they largely come from the kind of religious traditions. Am I right in understanding it that way? In the sense that the prescriptions that tell you how do you actually do this yoga dhyana or whatever, that is actually coming from more of the religious texts and traditions rather than art making traditions. Is that right?
So I think what he was trying to say there, I think he's saying that in many cases, the way traditional Western aesthetics looked at art, it was at the object of art. So, for instance, within art history, for instance, you study different art movements by looking at the relational properties of one to the other. So we look at the traditional art of the Renaissance and then later Impressionist art, and we think about the differences in form that take up the primary consideration, as well as perhaps the motivations of the individual artist. But I think what he's trying to say here is that he holds that it's not the material aspect that is important in Indian art, but first primarily it's that cognitive aspect that each artist comes up with that they bring to the table. I think he says in the first paragraph, my interpretation of it was that he's saying it is found in and again, we go back to the concept of the heretic and the servile and the free conceptions of art. So the free art was what is in Western Europe, and in Hegel's conception, at least, it's considered to be art that's created for its own ends, pleasurable art, versus the servile, which served another purpose. So it served religious purposes, or it served particular other wishes of a patron or some other aspect. So I think what he's holding is that in both of these types of art, it's traditionally held that only like the free art, the free conception of art for its own ends, is seen as as proper instances of high art within the dichotomy that developed there. So what I think he's saying is that both types of art in India, both craft, that includes the craft traditions, as well as what we would traditionally consider the more higher end artistic traditions, involve this element of cognitive use, and that is their starting point. And he says, contrary to perhaps the Western idea that the cognitive elements, the imagination is more stronger in the free art, he's saying it's more strongly seen in actually religiously motivated art created for religious ends. So I think in that religious text, he's saying that text has demonstrates, he says here, that it's seen in the most detailed expositions of the primary actor to be found in, however, it's in connection with the heretic prescription sadhana dhyana mantra that the most detailed expositions of the primary actor to be found. And these are of such interest and significance that it seems desirable to publish this rendering of the annotated text. I think he's saying that those ends, that art serving another religious end, doesn't take away from its artistic or imaginative value, and that it's seen most strongly in terms of in these religious texts, contrary to perhaps the popular Western idea that these artworks are somehow lesser because they're, in terms of their artistic merit, because they're created for other religious or other ends. So I think that's what he was trying to demonstrate.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah. Maybe we could, pause over there and see if, I don't know, Santosh and Nirali, you have any questions or thoughts on that same, like we're still on the first page, but if there's anything else you want to contribute or add or ask on that, that might be an easy way for us to like go at this like section by section.
I think no, Kai. Lakshmi has very beautifully explained the entire first page. We could move forward. Because and then it's in the next page that he goes on to speak of what happens when when the priest actually goes into the dhyana and like the imagining the orb of the moon and etc etc. So there's the whole thing that was listed. I think we could talk about that. That seemed a little interesting as to how he describes it. Yeah, I thought that we could discuss about that.
I think it's the same. I feel like Lakshmi just kind of explained that just very beautifully. I was also in the same perception whether he was trying to draw religious parameters and similarities parallelly, but I think it's a totally different notion to how he's kind of explained it. So yeah, that was really helpful. I think we keep good to go forward.
Yes. Yeah, I think we can read ahead. My first sort of response to kind of most of the second page, right? I think almost until the end of the second page, beginning of page 61, where he's talking about the so three things. One was starting with the image. I mean, this is kind of, I'm just saying it out loud as I remember it. Starting with there's a certain environment that what the person seats himself in. There's a certain specific image that he concentrates on, and then there is all of this sort of endorsing or attributing sort of a thing that happens, and then recitation or verses or whatever. What strikes me about this is the specificity of it, which is perhaps what I'm interested in understanding why, because of course that I'm sure every tradition which wrote the image that is concentrated on, or the kind of things that you say, verses that you chant, could be different. But I'm just trying to understand why is this prescription so specific?
specific also, like why blue lotus? Like why? I mean, there it says there 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 in a beautiful blue lotus within the filaments, the moon's unspotted orb. Why blue?
It looks to me that all those images don't exist in the real world. No.
I feel so as well. I felt like he was trying to paint certain images with different notions. I just felt like some of the images that he was talking about was just imaginary. Unlike
Yeah, you don't have an immediate physical parallel to conjure up. Like everything, even with the moon, it's moon's orb is developed from the primal sound. Like I don't even know what that.
Yeah, and then but then when he goes on to say that then with the sheets of lustrous rays that proceed from the yellow seed syllable. So that again is very realistic. Then we are back to, we can imagine that.
It seems like an image beyond the mind only to me. The yellow seed, all right, but then it's again yellow seed connected to a sound, and then rays that dispel the world's dark mystery throughout the 10 directions of the universe, indefinite limits of the universe, and stuff like that. So I think kind of forcing the mind to maybe expand or move beyond the realm of what is physically seen, observed, understood, maybe.
Not exactly like what Bill said right now, but I found it quite interesting the way he took that. The examples at the point that he was trying to demonstrate was that, of course, sorry. So there's this idea that the text itself it comes from a different metaphysical tradition in and of itself, and there are lots of different technical terms there and their own concept. But what I found interesting was the way he uses that to demonstrate the intellectual value seen in art. His point primarily was that these processes are far from an imitation of nature. It's a vivid use of imagination, extreme detail in the way each of these elements are described. And he's, I think, trying to push back. He says a little later as well regarding the Platonian conception of art, which is that everything's an imitation. The art is an imitation of nature, that it doesn't give us its own value or its own it doesn't have its own cognitive or intellectual basis. Everything we do in art, it's derived from watching, observing nature and the principles of the natural world. So I think that was a kind of demonstration that he was trying to show there. My interpretation of that was that rich use of metaphor and of the imagery that he used there is kind of an example of trying to push back against that. It's not an imitation of nature, but in itself, it's a very creative use of the imagination, even as it draws on other religious and other metaphysical ideals that it tries to express. Found his analysis of the text that he's cited towards its last paragraph in page 63. And he says, sadhana translated above differs only from others in that the sadhana mala in its more than average length and detail. The whole process is primarily one of worship and need not necessarily be followed by an embodiment of the visualized likeness in physical material. But where the making of an actual image is intended, it is inevitable, preliminary. Even when the artist actually works from a sketch or under verbal instruction, as it sometimes happens, this only means that the actus primus and the actus secundus are divided between two persons. The fundamental nature of the representation in all the details of its composition and coloring, and as regards the strictly ideal character of its integration, are in any sense determined by and can only be understood in light of the mental operation. The actus primus by which the given theme is made to assume a definite form in the mind of the artist, or was originally made to take shape in the mind of some artist. This form being that of the theme itself, and not the likeliness of anything seen or known objectively. In other words, what the sadhana supplies is a detailed sequence according to which the formal cause or pattern of work is to be done, is developed from its germ, from a mere hint of what is required. The hint itself corresponds to the requirement of the patron, which is its final cause, while the efficient and material cause are brought into play only if and when the artist proceeds to the servile operation, the act of imitation, and the similitude being with respect to the form. So in this part, I think what he's primarily trying to say is that even if the process of art, if we think of it as a craft and we see that division, so there's one person who comes up with the idea, or the art is intended to serve another purpose, a religious imagery, or follows certain textual prescriptions. He's saying the idea of the mental, the intellectual activity is inseparable, even if it's done by two different people, and that doesn't in any way take away from the intellectual value of the art itself. That's my understanding of that section.
I was also reading on page 61, which is basically the 4/4 trauma rupture, to then kind of explore what Lakshmi was talking about, the connection between nature that he was trying to dwell into, and that spiritual understanding of enlightenment, and hence the images that he's trying to unfold in front of us with different colors that probably the imagination is very less with it. I don't know if those are the connections that he was trying to make, because with Brahma rupture, I think it's about that intense enlightenment and the experience, the sensory experience. It's not something that just happens by itself. I don't know if there is a connection with that within the concept of nature and thing that he's talking about. That's what I'm trying to kind of draw parallels with.
Yes, that's really interesting. I think also that text mentions everything is immaterial. What exists is this pure conception of a certain idea or consciousness, as the metaphysics sees it, rather than a physical form. It basically says you understand what's real when you drop the physical understanding or view of the world in its physical forms. That had parallels to me as well to the way he's thinking about art. He's saying it's the concept that takes precedence over the material way in which it is represented.
I was reading a parallel text, and I just kind of pulled into the definition where they say attaining Brahma rupture would imply a heightened state of consciousness where the practitioner experiences a sense of unity with Brahma, leading to a feeling of ultimate bliss, peace, and oneness with the universe, where the meditative mind transcends ordinary sensory experiences to something large and big. So I'm assuming that the concept then widens up from there.
So Lakshmi, I'm just going to, of course, just put a question to you, which I don't know if is addressed in this essay at all. But in this sort of way of thinking, what, if any, importance is attributed to the product, if for want of a better word, the product, right, or the final artifact, or that piece of art that you create itself, from the point of view of understanding that specific artist's image? Like, does that matter at all, right? When I look at a painting, does that become my access point to that first level of art making that's happened in the artist's mind? And if so, how? Or is the product completely treated as just a byproduct and it sort of doesn't matter at that scale?
Going back to his essay last week, where he described art as both something that existed within the artist and in the way they expressed it. I think from that I would infer that he did think the physical artifact itself had some value. It's not just purely the intellectual idea, but I don't think he's saying that this idea needs to have come from the artists themselves. So it's not that particular artist's intention that matters, but just that it needed to have some intention given by somebody. Either the artist draws on the intentions of a patron or on a text or on the work of another artist. But then the art needs to have some idea involved or present in it. And that intention must be known to the viewer. Without an appreciation of that intent, they couldn't appreciate the artwork in itself. So I mean, towards the end of the essay, he talks about art that's taken from other cultures and placed in the context of art museums in the West. And he says there you cannot really understand it in its isolated context in a museum. So without knowing more about the tradition and the iconography in which that art developed. So the formal properties of an art and the artistic properties are not enough. It needs that intention, and without that intention, we're not seeing the work of art. We're seeing empty objects. I think that's where he would put it.
So that does sort of put a lot of onus on the audience or the viewer, so to say, also, right? Because it's as much like a process then to view and appreciate art, and it obviously cannot be without, because it's easy to get yourself to go and see that whatever performance or listen to something or think, but and this intention we're saying is not so much communicated verbally, not given away, in the sense that it's not said, okay, this is XYZ and that's what is trying to be done. So there's a lot of onus placed on the viewer or the interpreter to discover that for themselves as well. That's very interesting. It's like ratifying the fact that the audience needs to do some work. So I like it. I remember just, I mean, like something that Jayachandran said once is just sort of coming back to me like as an image, because possibly, like now it's making so much more sense to me. It was just like an image at that point of time. He was also talking about like a way of looking at it where, it's, I think he said something like the artist is pointing at, or through their work, pointing at, like, say, a common point. So he kind of just recasted this whole thing as like work of art or artist and viewer. Like that's how we imagine it usually. Viewer looking at the, if it's a performance, the artist or the work of art, whatever. But he kind of recast both of it as this way, as, the, right? Nirali, the kind of through the work of art, the artist is pointing to sort of a common point, and it's only when you're able to point the audience, or the audience is able to look in that same direction, and at that point, whatever rasa is created, or something like that, which
also reach, like not only like we pointed, but then when they meet there, like in terms of intention as well as connect, emotional connect, that's when the rasa is born.
So, Lakshmi, after page 63, the part that you read out, I kind of just, for the timing, I skipped to the end of the essay to find what you just mentioned about what he says about, the experiencing of the art, or the viewer of the art. 63 to 68. So is there anything there that you can also just guide us towards in terms of maybe a paragraph or two that could be, to latch on to immediately?
Sure. So maybe I can just take us through some things that I found interesting in those pages. So in going back to page 64, in the second paragraph, he says, before we relinquish the present consideration of the actus primus in Oriental art, reference must be made to another way in which the derivation of the formal image is commonly accounted for. It's assumed that upon an intellectual or angelic level of reference, the forms of things are intellectually emanated and have an immediate existence of their own. When this is mythologically formated, the reference becomes the heavens above. So, and he goes on to give examples that he takes from texts that speak about the imitation of angelic works of art and art from mythology, which he says he thinks is. I think in these paragraphs he's speaking to a certain sense about the imagination, as well as a certain sense of the of certain theosophical imprints or ideas, and how he doesn't see this as particularly contradicting the purpose of art as is traditionally imagined. So I think he's trying to say here, we also have extra-Indian parallels, the notion that art is particularly, or that it can represent religious themes and ideas in its content is not new to Indian art. It's present, new to art outside of India, but it's present in there are extra Indian parallels. He says it's present in, he gives a quote by Anidas, where he says, an earthly representation of music that there is in the rhythm of the ideal world. And they speak, so he says that all music is an earthly representation of the music that there is in the rhythm of the ideal world. So he says these ideas of art are not very foreign from each other. It's not, religious art and iconography is not a very isolated or exotic idea that originated in India, but there are parallels in these thinkings found in medieval European art. To that end, he also speaks about craft, and he says they also draw on a pattern. They take principles from that realm and from the thinking here, and he sees all of its individual work. So there's a quote again at the end of the page that says, all its individual parts were formed in the patterns of that above. That tallies, and they're not unlike, that's because they're not in any likeliness of anything on earth. They do not offend against the interdiction of idolatry, and they're not found in the form of similitude, in reference to which the prohibition was given. Again, there are two things that came out to me in this interpretation. He seems to be saying that all crafts, including building, carpentry, in which we're giving form, it draws on imagination. It draws on certain principles of realm of thinking, and then it starts from there. It's not just like an European conception of craft, which just seems a mechanical process towards a more functional end. All of these activities also involve a certain intellectual element, and that the notion of taking and creating art for religious purposes and religious ends, incorporating mythology, these were arguments that were traditionally used in the 1900s at the time that he was writing it by philosophers within Western philosophy to say that art was a specific conception of 18th century Europe. The concept of art was a specific conception that originated in 18th century Europe, and that other cultures perhaps had different conceptions of art based on their own religious and cultural context, and that their kind of art, what they thought of it as art, was different from what was thought of as art in the West. And I think he's trying to break that argument. He's trying to say that our parallels, at least found in some writing in medieval Europe and in ancient texts here, and I think he's trying to say that art in both places were created towards religious ends, and that even craft can be reformulated and thought of as as emanating from an intellectual idea, and that argument is what he's trying to break down. Was my understanding of these sections, and then in the next page, he speaks about the emphasis laid upon the strict, to quote, the strict self-identification of the artist with the imagined form should be especially noted. Otherwise stated, this means that he does not understand what he wants to express by means of any ideas external to himself. Nor indeed can there be anything be rightly expressed which does not proceed from within, moved by its form. Alike from the Indian and scholastic point of view, understanding depends on the assimilation of the known and of the knower and the known. This is indeed the divine manner of understanding, in which the knower is the known. For contra, the distinction of the subject from the object is the primary condition of ignorance or imperfect knowledge. For nothing is known essentially except as it exists in consciousness, and everything else is a supposition. So he's drawing heavily on the metaphysics of the earlier text that he quoted, and he's trying to break down the idea that everything that exists is broken down. Everything that can be known is indeed exists in consciousness. Everything else is supposition about the world. And he says here, understanding depends on the assimilation of the knower and the known. So art, in this sense, is an assimilation of both the ideas of the artist and its content. Is my interpretation. He says, particularly the artist needs to self-identify in some form. He says this means the artist does not understand what he wants to express by means of any idea external to himself. So he's really pushing back against the idea that art is something that's drawn from natural sources. He thinks art has to be, and in this way, that art is entirely what can be known to the artist themselves, and he's pushing back. He thinks knowledge. It's the contemporary, I think, the metaphysics in India of the epistemology in Indian theory was that this is a broad approximation. I'm not that familiar, but I think the idea was that everything is known. The way to access knowledge, or the ultimate truth, that comes from the individual and from contemplation, rather than from an external source. I think that's the metaphysics he's pulling here to say everything in the concept, the intellectual activity of the artist, it doesn't come from outside, from observation or from patterns of knowing or experiment, but then it's coming from this place of understanding oneself, and perhaps that's the entry point to the greater, to knowing the greater of the world. So I think that's where he's at in these two sections with his metaphysics. He says later in that chapter, given the value that we nowadays attach to observation and experiment as being the only valid grounds of knowledge, it's difficult for us to take these words literally and simply as they are intended. Yet there's nothing rhetorical in them, nor is the point of view an exceptional one. It's rather our own empiricism that is, humanly speaking, exceptional, that may be at fault. And he offers the work of the ideas of a Chinese painter in the 10th century. And he says this subtle painter was in Chinese art at that time, I think painting was considered the highest human art activity. And he says the first experiences in imagination, the instincts and the passion of all things that exist in heaven and earth. Then, in a manner appropriate to the subject, the natural forms flow spontaneously from his hand. And then he offers a European parallel to that. Every mental act is accompanied by an image, fixed and like a picture, the thought, the reason principle. The revealer is the bridge between the concept and the image taking faculty, and exhibits the concept as a mirror. In contemplative vision, especially when it's vivid, we're not at the time aware of our own personality. We're in possession of ourselves, but the activity is towards the object of the vision with which the thinker becomes identified. He's saying, in a way, the art making involves a certain kind of immersion in the process, where there is a certain metaphysics that he doesn't continue to fully, I think, explain or take us through that reasoning in this paragraph. But he's saying that there's parallels to this across cultures, and that the idea is our own imagination, or the artists, when they come in as an part of intellectual activity, and they're making art, there is a certain give of themselves and of their experiences along with towards the vision and with which they're working. So it's not based on the outside, but it comes from within. It comes from the art. They're of course borrowing ideas from the visual world, in the world around them, but then these are rooted in their own concepts of the self and their own knowledge, and that's what's ultimately expressed. So I'm not sure if that made sense, but I think that was that's at least my interpretation of what he was trying to do in that area.
Yeah, that was very, very, very helpful. I think just, first of all, to have peg points of kind of, it doesn't have to be read linearly, just to have points to mull over first. And I think it's an easy way for all of us to go back and reread the essay with a little bit more direction, I feel. Anything that I would very much vote for, maybe we should add this to our next week's discussion again, don't you think? Like along with the next essay, perhaps, just so that we don't lose that week, so to say. But it would be interesting, I think, for us to process it based on what we've heard Lakshmi shared today, and then come back with, thoughts or questions. I'd definitely like to do that. Yeah.
I think so as well. I feel we should do that.
Yeah, shall we? And any other sort of thoughts that, I think that's a great point to actually just because I'd like to actually just take away what I've heard and think about it for a bit before I lose the train of thought again. So unless like anyone has any other thoughts or questions or comments to add, maybe I'll give that a minute or two.
I think personally, this chapter specifically, it answered me as and how I proceeded further. The further I went, I found my answers that I was stuck in the beginning. And I guess just last where I had discussion, very casual discussion I was having with JC sir, Jayachandran sir, and he told me about Kumaraswamy looking at art in a way with a view of a paruksha. That this is where it is leading me to understand more. Where I think just the beginning itself, like Lakshmi said, and Lakshmi has been such a big help. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think in the beginning, the page number 60, where he says, making all this to shine downwards and leading forth the countless and measureless Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. I think the very idea of focusing on something that is countless and measureless in itself is I take it as a note to internalize my senses onto something that is already limitless. And for that, I have to go beyond whatever I have perceived outside. Only then I can perceive that I can only perceive with my mind. Only my mind will allow me to visualize that something that is so limitless and countless. So I guess that internalization of senses, even with the sound and vision, I think that's where it is leading, where only then the vision can be so impure and unhindered, I feel. Because again, it is coming back to translating into idioms that are again finite. And that's where he comes to the idea of world vortex. So, like I said, the further I read, my answers got resolved. But yeah, I mean, thank you, Lakshmi. Thank you. I would readdress this next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Pracheta. And indeed, yes, thanks, Lakshmi, for today. I think that was very much needed for all of us, clearly. So as agreed, we'll come back next week with essay 7, which is this one, and take a pass at the next one as well, which was meant to be next week's reading. Okay, let's do that. Yeah. Thank you, Lakshmi, and thank you, everyone.